Good morning, community. Welcome to another Keeping It Real with Dr. Anita podcast. I am your host, Dr. Anita Polite Wilson, C-Suite Trusted Advisor and Board Director, helping other members of the C-Suite reframe diversity conversations from difficult to different. We are back today on another Keeping It Real from the C-Suite conversation with Mr. Dwayne Robertson. He is the head of YPO's Diversity and Inclusion Office. We have had a couple of amazing conversations. I always go into the third conversation with mixed emotions because it's so good, but it's also our last conversation of this series. But I know that I'm going to have you back, Dwayne. Thanks for coming back this morning.
Glad to be back. I'm glad to continue the conversation.
Yes, and we're going to continue the conversation looking at the idea from the Harvard Business Review that says getting serious about diversity. And in particular, they suggest that what matters is how an organization harnesses diversity and whether it's willing to reshape its power structure. Before we get into that, I want you to expand on a quote that's on your LinkedIn profile. And it says, "Coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, working together is success." And that is a quote by Henry Ford. Expand on that and then tell us how that leads to the possibilities of reshaping the power structure so that diversity, inclusion, equity, accessibility, belonging efforts are not seen as performative or diversity washing.
I think that's a very relevant statement to the conversation we're going to have today. As I think about Henry Ford's statement, coming together is the beginning, keeping together is progress, and working together is success, it really describes how humans should be operating to, one, address an issue, two, come together and identify the best way to move forward, and then three, continuing the process to address that particular issue. So in other words, being constructive and then solving problems. Now, as we elevate this to the larger discussion around basically organizational commitment to diversity and inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think what this reveals is the potential gap, or the gap that exists between what an organization says it's committed to being, is vision for that, and then also the reality.
So when you talk about that, I hear aspirational. We aspire to, but are we willing to do what it takes to get there?
And I think that gap really exposes what that true culture of the organization is, particularly in regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion work. If that organization is not willing to take a critical look at itself, to identify what it does well, what it does not do well, and then also things that are critical issues that need to be addressed, and then bringing people together, the right people together, to collectively think about the appropriate ways to address that. And then the last point, which I think is, as we really think about this, is probably the most critical point as I relate this to Henry Ford's quote, working together is success. And then it's the working together that really exposes how serious that organization is.
Let me ask you a question, because I just had a thought. When you talk about organizations really being willing to look at the reality of where they are and the gap between where they are and where they want to be, a lot of times organizations don't want to admit that, especially once they've made all these wonderful statements about diversity and inclusion and belonging. And we've got a chief diversity officer, and, you know, we're doing this and we're doing that. We celebrate all the holidays, you know. What's an easy way for a corporation to look at the bare bones without necessarily beating themselves up? The thought that came to mind was a SWOT analysis. Could we do that in terms of, you know, are we really doing what it takes to get where we said we want to go? Would a SWOT analysis make it easier for a company to do it? Because it seems like the data that exists is not enough. And we've got a lot of reasons as to why. I'm thinking Simon Sinek, what's your why? I think we need to explore what's the why not.
I think that's an interesting statement. And I think I'm going to challenge you a little on the around data. And the reason why I say that is it's not necessarily easy for a particular organization to get data. Many times the fundamental question is, what type of data should we be looking for and why? But I think the question is, after that, does that company really want to really understand how its employees, particularly employees from marginalized groups, really perceive it? and then also perceive its commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think from a leadership perspective, that is an unanswered question that can be applied to many different organizations in our society. So just pushing back a little, I don't necessarily think it's just the data, because it's been my experiences that a lot of times the data is collected, but the results are not what those individuals who are involved in the process wanted to see. And it's exposing things that they either didn't want to see or were surprised to learn about.
So when you talk about pushing back, thank you, you're very gracious in it. And it leads me to another thought. Something about our conversations always leads me to another thought, other than where I had originally planned to go. Great Place to Work, if I'm not mistaken, is an organization where companies can actually look at their internal radius, their internal perspective, to see this is where we're doing great, this is where we could come up a little bit, and this is where we're missing the mark. So when you talk about data and actually analyzing it and being willing to accept what it says, is an organization like the Great Place to Work a good starting point?
I think it all depends on who the audience is for that data and what they're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also too, and I always try to balance out these perspectives, right? For example, it's well known that you have these different types of organizations such as Great Place to Work, Glassdoor, or whatever else that are devoted to individuals who are job seekers. But we always have to understand, and then I think this is also the other piece to diversity, equity, inclusion work. There's always going to be individuals who are not happy with what's being done. There's always going to be individuals who think that more can be done. So I think that there also has to be that balance as well in terms of the work that can be done, the level of commitment, even from senior leadership or the organization making changes. You're not going to be able to please everyone, and not everyone is going to look at the situation at hand and have an agreement on what it is.
Yes, I agree. And I'm reminded of a conversation that I was having in a recent board meeting where one of the members was talking about his own company. And he said, one of the challenges that we have is our frontline workers who are by and large Spanish speaking people. And he said, we're really trying to do what we can to reach out and present things in their language so that we can fix that language gap. And I said, while I appreciate that, belonging is more than just language. Belonging is a sense that you create within the organization. And I went on to share a story that about a time where I had to be taken off of a cruise ship and placed in a hospital in Mexico, not knowing the language, never ever having felt more safe, even though I didn't know the language. There was something about the environment and the way people looked at me and the way they gestured to my husband that it was going to be okay. And so when we're talking about a willingness to look at what we need to fix and do it with a critical eye, not critical to be mean, but critical to say we need to fix this, I think that's huge. And to your point about the audience and what it is that they're looking to hear, we need to make sure that we're exercising that intellectual humility that says, well, our numbers are pretty good and we're expecting this and we don't know where that came from. Well, if you don't know where that came from, that's an opportunity for you to exercise that intellectual and cultural humility to say, we didn't know what we didn't know. We made some assumptions and interpretations and applied some limiting beliefs. We've got to step back and be willing to say, we've got something to learn here. Do you agree with that?
I agree 100%. And I want to also add to it as well. If the results, let's say from a survey, the data, or any other type of information gathering process is not what you expected, I think that speaks to that gap, not only existing in understanding, but in terms of belonging, and then also how welcome those individuals feel. And I speak about this from a perspective where I've worked with some YPO chapters and helping them to better understand how all their members in a particular chapter might feel. And in similar types of situations, I'm like, well, this is a starting point. It's a starting point for you to make better connections and for you to work jointly. Because when we're talking about a sense of belonging, I thank you for sharing your experience in Mexico, that it went beyond just, numbers, and it was that human interaction. And I think in many organizations, they don't realize that it's a joint work, not just of the leadership of the organization, but then also those individuals who want to feel a sense of belonging. You have to create a space for them to be able to communicate and for them to be active players in the process.
So just to wrap this conversation, we were talking about an organization's ability to harness diversity requires a willingness to reshape the power structure. What are your thoughts on that statement?
Yeah, I think that is fundamental. And I think it speaks to some of the things that we talked about in our previous discussions in terms of the role of leadership, in terms of leadership operating from a place of good faith, and then also having an understanding from the beginning that this work may involve, to the point that you're making, that fundamental shift or fundamental changes to the current structure, whatever that might be, going beyond just having diverse individuals, adjusting certain operating procedures, and then also other factors that might be at play.
Right. And it's not to say, community, that organizations need to go in and dismantle everything all at once. That's not how life works. You can't dismantle everything all at once. But it is to say, let's go in and assess. Let's find the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, the things where we can get those immediate wins so that we can start some momentum going in the direction that we want to go. Dwayne Robertson, the director and head of YPO's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office, thank you so much for joining us. Community, I bring you these real conversations from the C-suite so that we can have some conversations that will convert to actions. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, if you want to hear this broadcast or our previous broadcast with Mr. Robertson or any of my previous guests, please go to the website, dranita.com. Remember, you need to spell out the word doctor. And on the landing page in the top in the center, click on the link that says Keeping It Real with Dr. Anita podcast. In the meantime, please follow, like, share. And if anything from this conversation has helped you to reframe diversity conversations from difficult to different, please share with your network. Until next time, this is Dr. Anita reminding you to stay blessed and keep it real.